So here we are, second week in a row. We've had some issues recording our services, and so we are re-recording the sermon, and it's getting up way later than I wanted it to. But here it is. We wanted you to have it. It's the second to last sermon in our series of kingdoms. This journey through Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, and so I hope that you are encouraged, challenged by this message. You know, there's this common misconception out there about how we learn as people, how we grow over time, how we change, what it takes for that to happen. Some people think of themselves as experiential learners, right? That they believe that they learn through personal experiences rather than picking up a book and reading somebody else's experience, or learning from somebody who's lecturing, or watching some film, or learning in any other way from the experiences of others. They believe they need to learn through their own experience. And so with that, then they end up believing that like a classroom isn't really for them, or a biography just isn't going to cut it. That they've got to get it out there and do all of the things for themselves, which includes often making mistakes. People who see themselves this way often believe that these personal experiences will automatically make them better, or more well-rounded, or wiser. But a growing mountain of brain data, the studies that have been done on our brains, suggest that very few of our experiences actually affect who we are, what we know, or what we think. The experiences that do shape us, the experiences that cause us to actually grow as humans, are the experiences that we have taken the time to intentionally reflect on. The experiences that cause us to grow are the experiences that we reflect on. This is why humans can learn from other people's experiences and not just our own, because we can reflect on someone else's experience without ever having had it ourselves. To learn from an experience, you just have to look back at it and consider what it might mean. Some of you at this point have probably already heard Jay share about his trip to Peru a couple weeks ago. As you listen to him, you can hear him already doing this reflection. Right on the surface, the story is simple. Jay hiked Machu Picchu for 4 days with some college friends, and they had an incredible time. But it is clear that this time in Peru was about significantly more than a buddy trip, at least for Jay. And I'll let you ask him about it, and you should. Because I can tell you now that you will be challenged in your faith if you listen to Jay's story and reflect on what it might mean for you, or even our church. To learn from an experience, again, you have to look back at it and consider what it means. We have to reflect deeply on our experiences if we expect them to change us. However, maybe you know someone who actually spends a lot of time looking back on an experience or a series of experiences, but they actually never seem to grow. All this looking back just seems to make them more sad, more bitter, or even just more stuck. What this means is that they aren't doing reflection. They're doing what psychologists call rumination. And psychologists describe this ruminating on past events as a dangerous mental practice where we obsessively live in some past event looking for maybe someone to blame or looking for some sort of explanation, the key that will resolve all of our inner turmoil and sadness or frustration. But even if we find someone to blame, even if we can explain it, rumination keeps coming back because we don't actually know how to move forward from the event. And so we stay there stuck. A friend of mine lost her daughter a few years ago. And for the first couple years, she couldn't stop ruminating on her daughter's death. She would send me messages all the time on a pretty regular basis asking me, why did she die? What does it all mean? What is God doing? She's trying to figure out, is there someone we can blame? Is there something any of us could have done to stop it? And I tried to encourage her, but she was stuck in that moment. But over time, something started to change in my friend. Her ruminations changed to reflection, and reflection gave her this bigger and healthier perspective. And now my friend is actually out in our community talking about her daughter, her daughter's beautiful life, but also her daughter's tragic death. And she is warning teenagers about some of the dangers they face. My friend has started to live again, and she's taking what she's learned from her experience, and she's making a difference in the lives of her neighbors. This story, this experience, it leads us right into our passage this morning. The death of Israel. For the last 4 months, we've been reading through Israel's story together. We've experienced with Israel the highest of highs and the lowest of lows. Israel, a people formed by God, called by God, put in this place by God for a profound purpose, and yet here is their tragic and devastating end. This nation, called Israel, ceases to exist. And maybe you can imagine putting yourself in their position, how easy it would have been for the Israelites, defeated by their enemies, scattered throughout the world, to ruminate on all of this. Looking for someone to blame, desperate for answers, stuck in this moment of their death. In fact, in the passage we just heard read, verses 1-6 give us some of the low-hanging blame fruit. Right? Who's to blame? It's easy. Hoshea is, right? He was king for 9 years. The buck stops with him. And so, Hoshea, he's the reason this all happened. But did Hoshea do anything specifically to cause this tragedy? Well, we read 2 Kings 17:2. He did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh. So there you go, right? You can't just go around doing evil willy-nilly and expect things to go well. But maybe that's not the entire story, because we're told in verse 2 that Hoshea's evil was not as the kings of Israel who were before him. So then, if it's not as evil specifically, maybe it's all of Hoshea's foolish political dealings. These verses tell us that Hoshea aligned himself with a ruthless and powerful emperor. And Hoshea agreed to pay this emperor money so that he would leave Israel alone. But then Hoshea tried to double cross this emperor by turning to another king for help on the side. And then Hoshea just altogether stopped paying the money he had promised to the emperor. So, right, maybe it wasn't Hoshea's evil that caused the death of Israel. Maybe it was just Hoshea's stupidity. All of this political maneuvering, all of these games, it just seemed unwise. Maybe Hoshea's foolishness is the reason Israel was destroyed. And the longer you ruminate on what happened, it's Hoshea's evil, Hoshea's foolishness. But then there's even still just the Assyrians, this empire that was brutal, had a brutal reputation, and they just moved through the Middle East like a bully, pushing around everyone, demanding money from everyone, and just beating up anyone who didn't pay. And so maybe if you're feeling gracious, you might say Hoshea didn't have any real legitimate options. He did the best that he could, and he was stuck in the face of a vicious bully without any good options. So our passage, it runs through each of these potential ways of explaining what has happened. And we should recognize immediately these easy blame targets, right? Blame your leaders, blame your enemies. Pretty straightforward. I mean, think of any organization you've ever been a part of. Think of organizations that you're just, aware of. Think of a team that implodes, a church that falls apart, a company that goes bankrupt and out of business, a nation collapsing. What are our go-to explanations for each of these circumstances? It's the leader's fault. It's the leader's fault. Either the leader has bad character, the leader's evil, or the leader's unwise, made foolish decisions. Or both, right? The point being, it's the leader's fault. The leader caused this. Or if it's not the leader's fault, it is some external enemy's fault. Now, as a Raiders fan, I can confidently tell you that the refs and the Patriots are the reason we are not in the Super Bowl every single year. Churches like to blame Satan and the world for the death of our churches, for the bad things that happen in our churches. Companies blame the economy. Or competitors for a company going under. And nations have, just kind of all sorts of enemies they can blame. Rival nations or immigrant populations or the economy or natural disasters. And listen to me, right? This is not to say that none of these things are factors or even true. But when we ruminate on some moment, and we blame the leaders or we blame our enemies, we will get stuck. We will live in past memories with no path forward for ourselves. How do we take responsibility for the next steps we need to take? We will obsess over what could have been, and we will miss the opportunity to learn from the past, to grow, and to live now in a new way informed by what has happened. The book of Kings doesn't deny that Hoshea or the Assyrians did things that were the direct and immediate cause of Israel's destruction. But the book of Kings shifts its focus to the people and to their historic failures to follow their God faithfully so that they could learn and walk in a new direction. Verse 7, we read, "And this occurred because the people of Israel had sinned against Yahweh their God, the God who brought them up out of the land of Egypt from under the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Now the writer goes on to tell us 4 key ways the people of Israel sinned against Yahweh their God. And if you're taking notes today, like these 4 things are essential to keep track of. First, the people of Israel feared other gods besides Yahweh, and walked in the customs of the nations whom Yahweh drove out before the people of Israel. Second, the people of Israel walked in the customs that the kings of Israel had practiced. So, it's not enough to just blame the kings if you are following and imitating the kings. Third, the people of Israel did secretly against Yahweh their God things that were not right. And finally, in verse 13, we read, Yahweh warned Israel by every prophet and every seer, saying, turn from your evil ways, keep my commandments and my statutes, in accordance with all the law that I commanded your fathers and that I sent to you by my servants the prophets. God sent prophets to these people, but the people of Israel would not listen. But they were stubborn, as their fathers had been, who did not trust in Yahweh, their God. The passage goes on to list a bunch of specifics, the specific ways that they do these 4 things, specific ways the Israelites sinned against Yahweh, and ways that they worshiped other gods. And we could look at these. In fact, later this year, we are going to actually read the prophets, and we are going to hear some of the very things that they were doing to each other and amongst each other. But I'm not sure any of us are really all that tempted to put up an Asherah pole or to serve Baal. And so instead, what I want to do is I want to focus on these 4 categories we just read, just generally, because I think that these 4 categories give us some helpful ways to reflect on our own responsibility. Our own responsibility as part of a church family, as part of a city, as part of a nation. And so these 4 questions I want you to have, and I want you to consider this week. What would it look like to spend some time each day considering each of these questions? The first one is this: in what ways do we fear, serve, or obey any God other than Jesus? In what ways do we fear, serve, or obey any God other than Jesus? Number 2, in what ways do we imitate the practices of our leaders? Right? Even though we know that these practices conflict with the way of Jesus. And so whatever it is that our leaders are doing that might be corrupt, that might be inappropriate, in what ways do we then give ourselves permission because they are doing these things? And we just take on their personality and their characteristics. Number 3, what do we do in secret that we hope our fellow brothers and sisters don't find out about? What do we do in secret that we hope our fellow brothers and sisters don't find out about? And then number 4, how do we respond when someone, a preacher or a friend, calls us to a more faithful path? I mean, a good way of testing this 4th one. How do we respond when someone, a preacher or a friend, calls us to a more faithful path? Did you take the time to even write these questions down, assuming that in this moment, this preacher is giving you questions from God's word that would help you to grow, to be a holier lover of God. And I wonder if you would pause this, just sit with these questions for a minute. Give yourself some time with them each day to just consider. And I want you to think as you work through these questions of maybe a struggling organization that you care about. Maybe the organization you care most about, that some struggling group. And if you can, for the moment, set aside the leader's failures. Set aside whatever external enemies that you are worried about. And for now, this is an organization you care about, that you are a part of. Just consider your role in that organization. Kids and teenagers, you get to do this too. This isn't just for your adults, for your parents, right? You can think of the role that you play in your family. What's your place? What's your responsibility? What's your role, your responsibility on your sports team? In your class, or in any other group that you might be a part of. Think of a team, a group that you're a part of. Maybe just think of the class that you go to every day with a teacher and other students. Maybe that's the place where things aren't going well. And you could blame your teacher. Right? You could blame your coach. You could blame your siblings or your classmates or whoever. But the Bible is teaching us, all of us, to look at our own lives. To look at the speck in our own eye rather than the log in our sibling's eye. To reflect on how we are living and to see the responsibility that we each have toward each other. The responsibility we each have to the other people in our families, toward the people in God's family, toward our neighbors and toward our enemies and so on, right? God is showing us how to find our responsibility and do something about it before it is too late. That sounds ominous, right? You may have noticed that we're only in chapter 17 in the book of 1st and 2nd Kings. And you might be wondering, like, how could there possibly be 8 more chapters after the death of Israel? Well, Israel is made up of only 10 of the 12 total tribes. And Israel up in the north is done for. They are gone. But there is still a second nation made up of God's people in the south. The tribes of Judah and Benjamin are still alive. Time has not run out for them. And this reflection on Israel's sin is actually intended as a warning for the southern kingdom. They don't have to make the same mistakes. They don't have to wait until it's too late. They don't have to follow the same path. God had hoped Israel would respond sooner or at all, that Israel in the north would turn back to him. I mean, he gave them countless chances again and again through his word, through each prophet, one after another. But now here in chapter 17, it's too late for them. They've exhausted all of their chances. And their destruction stands as a warning. Their experience is an opportunity for others to learn, for others to reflect on their experiences, for others to go a different direction. And the question is whether others will reflect. But I want to tell you something that's kind of cool. Chapter 17 feels pretty final. Like death. That's why I called it the death of Israel. And yet, Samaria, Israel's capital city, is where Jesus comes and meets a woman at a well. Samaria is where Jesus sends his disciples to preach peace to homes and villages. Samaria is one of the very first places to receive the good news that Jesus is Lord and that he has been raised from the dead. Right? This is amazing. Even after everything that has happened in Samaria, all of Samaria's disobedience and rebellion, hundreds of years later, God shows up and has grace for these people. Right after every possible way that Israel could sin against their God, including, and you may have heard this in our reading, including the burning of their sons and daughters as offerings. Israel's sin wasn't too great for God's grace. God's ability to forgive far exceeds our ability to sin. And so, passages like this teach us not to hide in our sin, not to be afraid of our sin or what our sin might bring. Our passage teaches us not to deny our sin, but instead to acknowledge, to confess our sin, to confess and acknowledge the ways that our sin has hurt others, and then to take our sin to Jesus, the one who died for it, the one who forgives us even now. This is the only way to get unstuck from our sin, to learn and to grow in love and holiness. And this morning we have a special treat. Before we come to the table this morning to remember what Jesus did for our sin, we're going to hear a story of God's grace. At least that's what we did on Sunday. We listened to Crystal's story. And if you get a chance, ask Crystal to tell you her story. If you need to hear it again and be reminded of how God showed up and showed grace again, a grace that exceeds our sin. May you know the transforming love of Jesus. Grace and peace, brothers and sisters. Amen.